I still remember the sting of that night as if the cold air outside that house had frozen it onto my skin forever. There I was standing on the wide stone steps of my daughter's grand home in the hills outside Seattle, clutching a simple wooden frame with a faded photograph inside. The picture showed three smiling faces: me, my wife long gone, and Maddie when she was still small enough to fit into my arms. I thought it was the perfect gift for a 10th anniversary party. Something real. Something that reminded them where it all began. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The driveway was lined with expensive cars, sleek, shining imports, and polished SUVs, each one screaming money. The house itself glowed like a jewel against the night sky. Strings of lights ran across the manicured hedges. Jazz music floated out of the tall windows, and I could hear the soft roar of laughter as guests toasted champagne. It was a world I had never belonged to, though I had helped pay the bills more than once when my son-in-law's ventures wobbled. I hesitated on the porch, smoothing down the collar of my worn jacket. It was the best I owned, pressed earlier that afternoon with careful hands. My heart beat faster with every muffled laugh from inside. I told myself this was a family celebration. Surely there would be a seat at the table for the man who once worked 2 jobs so his daughter could have braces and piano lessons. Surely. The door opened and a wave of warmth and perfume washed over me. I stepped inside, careful, almost apologetic, into the grand foyer, with its marble floor and chandelier dripping with crystals. Maddie spotted me before I could find my bearings. Her dress shimmered, her hair done up the way society women wear theirs. For a brief second her eyes softened, but just as quickly something else took over, embarrassment maybe, or fear of what her guests would think. A man near the buffet table leaned toward his wife and whispered, not quietly enough, "Is that her father?" The way he said it, as though I were a surprise no one wanted. Maddie crossed the room quickly, heels clicking like a warning. She didn't greet me with a hug, not even a polite smile. Instead, she glanced at the photo frame in my hands, then at the curious eyes following her across the room. Her voice, low but firm, cut through the jazz and chatter. "Dad, please, leave. This is our night, not yours. I can't explain the sound of your own child telling you to go. It doesn't echo, it hollows." The chatter of guests blurred. The chandelier seemed to dim, and all I could hear was the soft thud of my own heart. For a second I thought I might drop the frame, but my fingers tightened around it like a lifeline. I looked at her face. Not the little girl who used to press daisies into my calloused hands, but a woman who had built walls higher than any house Ethan ever sold. Her eyes darted around the room, checking to see who had heard. Everyone had. I smiled, though my chest ached as if it had been split open. "Of course," I said softly. "Of course." I turned and walked back through the foyer, past the valet who held the door with an awkward half bow, and out into the cool night. Behind me, the music swelled again. Laughter resuming as if nothing had happened. Out on the graveled drive, I stood still, the lights of Seattle twinkling faintly beyond the hill. My hands trembled as I tucked the photograph under my arm. I wanted to leave it behind to let her see it later and remember, but a part of me knew she would not look twice, so I carried it with me step after heavy step down the long drive. The night air carried a faint mist from the sound. I could taste salt on my lips as I reached my truck parked down the road, the oldest vehicle in sight by decades. I placed the frame gently on the passenger seat before climbing in. The engine coughed to life, a tired sound, yet steadier than the voice I carried inside me. Driving home, I thought of all the Sundays spent side by side in our old wooden pew, the potlucks at church where Maddie used to run around with frosting on her cheeks, the Christmas mornings when she tore open gifts I had bought with overtime pay. I thought of the nights I had sat awake balancing bills, choosing which payment could wait so she wouldn't have to. And I thought of how quickly she had brushed me aside as though all of it had been nothing more than background noise to the music of her new life. As I pulled into my own driveway, nothing grand, just a single-story house, with peeling paint and a porch light that flickered now and then, I sat in silence for a long while. My neighbors, the Porters, were still up. I could see the blue glow of their television through the curtains. Mrs. Porter sometimes brought me pies on Sundays. She'd ask after Maddie, and I'd always say, "She's busy doing well." Tonight I didn't want her to ask. I carried the frame inside, setting it on the small table by the window. The house smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee, a comfort I clung to. I poured myself a glass of water, sat in the worn armchair, and stared at the photo. My wife's smile, Maddie's gap-toothed grin. They didn't know the future. They didn't know this night would come. When I closed the door behind me that night, the quiet of my little house wrapped around me like an old coat. The silence was different from the hush inside Maddie's mansion, where music and chatter had only paused long enough for her words to cut me down. Here the quiet was thick, lived in the kind that settles into the walls of a place that has seen decades of ordinary days. I set the photo frame back on the small table by the window and stood for a long moment staring at it. My wife's smile beamed out at me, the corners of her eyes wrinkling the way they always did when she laughed. Maddie was missing her front teeth in that picture, her little hand clutching a toy rabbit. I could almost hear their voices the way laughter once filled these rooms. But the house had been empty for years, and the only sound now was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I pulled out the old wooden chair at the kitchen table and sat down. My hands lay flat against the surface, rough and scarred from years of work at the tax office and side jobs I had taken just to keep food on the table. I remembered those years after my wife passed, long nights trying to figure out how to raise a teenage girl alone. I did the laundry. I burned dinners more often than not, and I tried to make birthdays special, even when the money was tight. Maddie used to hug me and whisper that I was the best dad in the world. Somewhere along the way, those whispers had turned into sighs, then complaints, and now rejection. The porch light flickered outside. I carried myself to the front step and sat down, the wood creaking under my weight. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. I rubbed my knees sore from years of climbing courthouse steps and shuffling boxes of files. Across the street, I saw the curtain twitch at the Porter's house. A minute later, Mrs. Porter appeared wrapped in her cardigan, her small dog trotting at her feet. "Well, Leonard," she called out softly, careful not to wake her husband. "Out late again, are you?" I gave a half smile. "Something like that." She came closer, the dog sniffing around my porch. "Saw the cars going up to the Hartley place earlier." "Big due tonight," I nodded. "10th anniversary." Mrs. Porter's brows lifted. "And did you stay long?" I hesitated. The truth lodged in my throat like a stone. I didn't want her pity. I didn't want the neighborhood gossip mill spinning my shame into morning coffee talk, so I cleared my throat and said, "Long enough." She studied me, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. But she didn't press. Instead, she reached down and picked up her little dog. "Well, I hope they appreciated it. Children can be a handful. Mine still call now and then, but they've got their own lives. Don't let it get you down, Leonard." I thanked her and she shuffled back across the street. I stayed on the porch long after her lights went out, staring into the dark. The sound of the distant traffic on the highway reminded me the city was still awake, even if my part of it was not. The next morning I stopped at the diner on Main Street. The coffee there was always burnt, but the waitress, a woman named Carol, knew how to pour without asking questions. I slid into my usual booth by the window, ordered eggs and toast, and unfolded the newspaper. The bold headline made me pause. "Hartley Real Estate under scrutiny, possible IRS investigation looms." My hand tightened around the edge of the paper. My eyes scanned the article, which quoted unnamed sources and hinted that a disgruntled former employee might have filed a complaint. There it was, the red herring laid plain. Everyone would think the whistleblower was some angry staffer with a grudge. I sipped my coffee, bitter and hot. The truth sat heavier than the eggs cooling on my plate. Because I knew something nobody else did, those files, the ones Ethan had once begged me to keep quiet about, were still in my possession. I had locked them away years ago, telling myself I'd never use them. That promise now felt like a weight pressing harder on my chest with every word I read. Across the diner, a group of retirees played cards, their voices carrying over the clink of dishes. "They say Hartley's empire's built on sand," one of them chuckled. "Wouldn't surprise me if it all comes crashing down." I folded the paper and stared out the window at the gray sky. The rain was coming, and with it something else, something I could no longer hold back forever. The newspaper folded under my arm felt heavier than it should have. I walked home from the diner that morning with the words, Hartley Real Estate under scrutiny, echoing in my head. Folks at the next table had laughed it off as gossip, but for me it wasn't gossip. It was a reminder of something I had carried for too long. Back inside my house, I set the paper on the counter and stared at the window. The glass reflected a man older than I wanted to admit, lines deep on my forehead, gray hair that refused to stay combed. For a moment I was back in another kitchen, Ethan's. It had been a few years earlier before his company took off before the marble floors and catered parties. He had called me over one evening saying he needed advice. I remember thinking it odd. Ethan never asked for my opinion on anything that mattered, but I went. Maddie had asked me gently, and I was still the kind of man who tried to help. The kitchen smelled of new paint and ambition. Boxes of files sat stacked on the table. Ethan wore that easy smile of his, the one he put on like a tailored suit. He gestured to the chair. "Leonard," he said, "you worked with numbers your whole life. Take a look at this, will you?" I opened the first folder and began flipping through. At first it was routine contracts, receipts, tax forms. But patterns jumped out at me. Numbers that didn't add up. Income streams that were shuffled, expenses padded with things that had no business being written off. I looked up. "Ethan, these don't look right." He leaned back, arms crossed, grin slipping just a little. "Not right or not smart," I frowned. "You're reporting things that never happened. You can't just hide money in shell accounts and call it overhead. That's fraud." He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You've seen too much, old man. Better keep quiet if you want to stay part of this family." The words struck harder than if he'd raised his hand to me. I stared at him, waiting for a chuckle, a wink, anything to show he was joking. But his eyes were flat, his jaw tight. He meant it. Maddie walked in at that moment carrying a tray of iced tea. She set it down and kissed Ethan on the cheek, then looked at me. "Dad, is everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Fine, just looking over some numbers." Ethan slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Your dad's got a sharp eye, Maddie. I'm lucky he's on my side." She laughed lightly, but I caught the flicker in her eyes. She knew more than she let on, though she didn't want to admit it. She wanted to believe her husband was the successful man he pretended to be. Later, when Maddie walked me to the door, she lowered her voice. "Dad, I know you worry, but Ethan's building something real. People don't always play by the book. Please just trust us." I wanted to tell her everything I'd seen in those papers. I wanted to shake her shoulders and remind her of the values her mother and I had raised her with. But I didn't. The way she looked at me, half pleading, half warning, kept me silent. I carried that silence home that night along with the copies I had quietly made. Ethan didn't notice me slip a few documents into my bag. Maybe he thought his threat was enough to scare me. But I wasn't scared. I was ashamed of what my daughter had married into, ashamed of how powerless I felt to stop it. Now, sitting at my own kitchen table years later, the newspaper headlines staring back at me, I thought of that evening again. Ethan's words replayed in my head sharp as broken glass. "You've seen too much. Better keep quiet." I rubbed my temples and closed my eyes. The silence of the house pressed in. Somewhere down the street I heard the faint sound of kids riding bikes, their laughter carrying on the wind. For a moment I wished Maddie were still one of them, innocent, carefree, running home to show me a good grade or a drawing she had made. But those days were gone, replaced by a woman who had looked me in the eye and told me to leave her party. I walked to the small cabinet in the corner and pulled out the old file box. My hands hesitated on the lid. Inside were the copies I had made sealed away all these years. I didn't open it, not yet. But I placed it on the table where I could see it, where it could see me. I finally sat down again, staring at the lid. My fingers tapped the wood slow and steady, as if to test my own patience. I could almost hear Ethan's voice in my ear, slick and sharp, reminding me that silence kept me in the family. But it wasn't silence that built families. It was truth even when it burned. I thought back to another night years ago when Ethan had cornered me after church potluck. He had shaken my hand with that tight squeeze men use when they want to send a message. His smile stayed plastered on, but his eyes told the truth. "You've done enough for us, Leonard," he'd said softly and almost kindly. "But if you keep sniffing around those numbers, well, Maddie won't appreciate it. She wants peace. Let her have it." I had nodded, then swallowing my pride for the sake of keeping harmony. I had walked out into the church parking lot holding a dish of leftover casserole and wondered when I became the man who looked away. Now, years later, the weight of that decision pressed harder. Because Maddie had not found peace. She had found distance. Each step she took away from me had been paved with Ethan's false promises and my quiet consent. The rain began tapping against the window, soft at first, then steadier. I reached over and flicked on the lamp. The glow fell across the table, catching the edge of the photo frame I'd set aside the night before. Maddie's little smile, missing teeth, and all stared back at me. She hadn't been ashamed of me then. She hadn't thought I was too old, too plain, too much of a reminder of where she came from. My chest tightened. I pulled the box closer and lifted the lid. The smell of old paper filled the room. Inside were neat stacks of folders, each one labeled in my handwriting. I had copied only what mattered most: receipts altered beyond recognition, tax forms that bore numbers like scars, records of payments funneled into accounts overseas. Evidence strong enough that even a rookie auditor would see the fraud. I ran my fingers along the edges, remembering the night I had made those copies. My hands had shaken then too, but not from fear, from betrayal. I leaned back, listening to the rain and the faint hum of the refrigerator. For years, I had convinced myself I kept these papers only as insurance, a kind of shield in case Ethan ever tried to push me further out of Maddie's life. But the truth was simpler. I kept them because deep down I knew a day like that night at the party would come when I would need more than my word to prove what kind of man Ethan really was. Sunday mornings at St. Mark's had a rhythm of their own. The bells tolled, and folks from every street nearby filed in, young families corralling children, widows walking slow but steady, old friends greeting one another with hugs that smelled faintly of perfume and aftershave. I had walked these steps most of my life. It was the same wooden door I had pushed open with Maddie's small hand in mine years ago. She used to tug me inside, eager to see the choir. Inside, the air carried the scent of wax and old hymnals. Light streamed through stained glass, coloring the pews in blues and reds. I slid into my usual seat near the middle, nodding to Mrs. Porter, who gave me a sympathetic smile. I pretended not to notice. Pity was a heavier burden than loneliness. The choir sang, voices rising toward the rafters, and I let the sound wash over me. For a moment, I forgot about Ethan's threats and Maddie's cold words. But when Pastor Caldwell stepped to the pulpit, his sermon struck me with a force I couldn't ignore. "Honor thy father and mother," he said, his voice carrying through the sanctuary. "For this is the first commandment with a promise." The words cut through me like a blade. I felt every eye shift toward me, though I knew that was only in my imagination. Still, the verse landed heavy. My daughter's face flashed in my mind, not the grown woman in sequins, but the little girl who once clutched my hand. Where had that child gone? I gripped the back of the pew, knuckles white. Pastor Caldwell went on speaking about respect, about how families fray when honor is abandoned. His voice softened at the end, but it didn't lessen the sting. I lowered my head, wishing I could disappear into the wood. After the service, folks lingered in the fellowship hall where coffee percolated in tall silver urns and plates of donuts sat out. I poured myself a cup and leaned against the wall, watching as people chatted about grandchildren, doctor's appointments, and the Seahawks game. It all felt like another world. That's when I heard a familiar laugh. Thomas Miller, an old colleague from my IRS days, walked up, still broad-shouldered, though his hair had thinned. He slapped me on the back with the same force he used to drop case files on my desk. "Well, I'll be damned, Leonard," he said. "Haven't seen you in ages. Still keeping your head down, huh?" I smiled faintly, trying to. We talked a bit about old times, the long nights combing through audits, the arguments with lawyers who thought they could outwit the system. Thomas shook his head and chuckled. "Funny how some men think they can cheat forever," he said, sipping his coffee. "But the truth always catches up. Always." My throat tightened. I thought of Ethan's smirk, the folders in my kitchen, the way Maddie had begged me to trust him. Thomas leaned closer. "Word around town is Hartley's under investigation. IRS sniffing around. Some say one of his old employees finally had enough. Guess even the slick ones slip up." I forced a nod, keeping my voice even. "So I've heard." Inside, my chest burned. Thomas's words gave the perfect cover, a scapegoat everyone could believe. An angry employee, a grudge, a leak. No one would look at me. No one would know. I left St. Mark's with the bells ringing behind me, the taste of coffee still bitter on my tongue. The sermon and Thomas's comment rattled around in my head. The choice I'd been avoiding was closing in. The papers on my table weren't just insurance anymore. They were a verdict waiting to be read. When I closed the door behind me that Sunday evening, the house seemed smaller than it had in years. The sermon, Thomas's words, and Mrs. Porter's quiet reminder had all trailed me back, but it was the wooden box on my table that swallowed the room whole. Its corners caught the fading light sharp and certain, daring me to lift the lid again. I brewed another pot of coffee, though I'd already had more than enough. The hiss and drip of the machine filled the silence, the scent bitter and grounding. I poured a mug, set it down, and pulled the box closer. My fingers brushed the lid. It was cool, steady, like a stone that had waited too long in a riverbed. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking like an old confession. Inside lay the folders, my handwriting scrawled on the tabs, each one a scar across time. I pulled out the top file, opened it flat on the table. Receipts altered beyond reason. Expenses bloated with phantom numbers. Deposits rerouted into accounts that Ethan swore no one would ever trace. I traced the ink with my finger, remembering the night I had made these copies. I had sat at Ethan's kitchen table, his words still ringing in my ears, "Keep quiet if you want to stay part of this family." My hand had shaken as I slid the papers into my bag. I hadn't thought of myself as a thief that night. I thought of myself as a father trying to salvage some shred of truth for the daughter I could no longer reach. The lamplight blurred. I realized my eyes were wet. I wiped them roughly with the back of my hand, but the tears came anyway. The photo frame sat nearby, Maddie's gap-toothed grin peering out as though she were laughing at a joke I'd told. She used to climb onto my lap, grab my face with both hands, and declare I was her favorite person in the whole wide world. That memory struck harder than Ethan's threats ever had. My hand moved almost without thought. I pulled open the drawer beneath the counter, fingers closing around the old silver lighter I kept there. It was engraved, my retirement gift from the office. The words etched faint but firm, "For a job well done." I flicked it open, thumb rolling the wheel until the flame leapt to life. The blue and orange glow licked the air, reflected against the slick surface of Ethan's forged documents. The heat pricked my skin, the faint smell of butane mixing with coffee and paper. For a long moment I hovered there. One drop of ash, and all of it could vanish. The weight I had carried for years could turn to smoke. Maddie would never have to know how close I came to dismantling her world. The IRS would never get its hands on proof that could ruin Ethan. My nights could be quieter, my days simpler. But then what would that leave me? A man who spent his life telling his daughter to do right, only to bury the truth in his own kitchen. I closed my eyes, the flame burning steady. I heard Maddie's voice on the phone begging me not to dig. I saw her face at the party, cold and embarrassed, telling me to leave. I felt the bruise of those words deep in my chest. And then the photo again, her little arms around my neck. Her cheeks pressed into mine, eyes alight with the kind of love that didn't question or calculate. That was the Maddie I had raised. That was the child I still carried. My hand trembled lighter, close enough that the edge of one paper curled. A dark line rose, smoke twisting upward like a warning. I snapped the lid shut. The flame died with a sharp click, but the smell of singed paper lingered in the air. I sat back, chest heaving, the lighter still warm in my hand. The truth had almost gone up in smoke, almost. The smell of scorched paper clung to the air long after the lighter snapped shut. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the thin curl of smoke that still lingered, a ghost rising from the edge of Ethan's forged receipts. My hand trembled, the lighter heavy as iron in my palm. I set it down carefully, as though it might flare back to life on its own. The box of papers sat open, a silent witness to my hesitation. The house around me seemed to hold its breath. I thought of my wife. She had been the steady one, the voice that kept me anchored when I wanted to drift toward despair. What would she have said, seeing me hover on the edge of destroying the truth? She had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. I rubbed my face with both hands, the stubble rasping against my palms. The tears came again unbidden. They were not just for Maddie or for the man she had chosen, but for myself, for the years I had kept quiet, for the times I had swallowed my pride to keep her close, only to be pushed further away. The ticking of the old wall clock grew louder, each second pounding against my ribs. Time was moving with or without me. I could not sit here forever, trapped between fire and silence. I pulled the photo frame closer. Maddie, missing teeth, laughing at some forgotten joke. I touched the glass, my finger tracing the outline of her little face. "Where are you, kiddo?" I whispered. "Where did you go?" The truth was she hadn't gone anywhere. She was still here inside the woman who had turned me away at her party. But Ethan's shadow had covered her, pulling her further into a world where appearances mattered more than blood. I closed the box, not to hide it, but to gather strength. My hands pressed flat against the lid. I knew now I couldn't burn it. The papers were more than evidence, they were my voice, my shield, maybe even my only chance to make Maddie see the truth. I didn't have to open the newspaper the next morning to know trouble had started. Trouble has its own way of traveling through whispers at the diner, through half-finished sentences outside the post office, through the way neighbors tilt their heads together when they think you're not listening. By the time the headlines caught up, the rumors were already running wild. Hartley real estate was no longer untouchable. People were talking about audits, about secret accounts, about holes in the empire that Ethan had paraded as unshakable. For years he had strutted around that mansion on the hill as though it were carved from stone. But stone can crack, and when it does, it's not quiet. That evening I heard from Thomas again. He had a way of making his words sound casual, but I could hear the weight beneath them. "Your son-in-law had himself quite a meeting today. Boardroom fireworks, voices raised, papers slammed. Not the kind of thing a man wants investors to see. I pictured it easily. The long conference table, the polished wood gleaming under two bright lights. Ethan at the head, his charm stretched thin as the numbers turned against him. I had seen that expression before when a cornered man tries to bluff, tries to convince himself he still holds all the cards. Maddie would have been there too. She had become his shadow in those meetings, smiling at the right times, offering polite nods while Ethan promised the moon. But this time I imagined the mask slipping. Later that night, I sat by the window, the box of papers still on the table behind me, and I thought about Maddie, seeing Ethan for what he truly was. Would she recognize the sharpness in his voice, the way his jaw locked when he lied? Or would she smooth it over as she always had, convincing herself it was stress, nothing more? The answer came sooner than I expected. Mrs. Porter told me over her fence the next day. She had a cousin who worked in one of Ethan's offices. Word had trickled down from the boardroom itself. Ethan had slammed his hand on the table, shouting, "Nobody's got proof." His voice had carried rattling the glass pitchers of water. He had dared anyone to question him, to bring forward evidence he swore didn't exist. I knew then that the cracks were spreading. His denial was too loud, too desperate. A man who truly believed he was safe didn't have to shout it. And Maddie, what had she felt sitting in that room? Shame, fear, or the stubborn hope that the man she married was still the one she wanted him to be. That night I lay awake long past midnight. The lighter rested in the drawer, the box stayed closed on the table. But my mind replayed Ethan's words. Nobody's got proof. He was wrong. Proof was sitting 20 feet away, waiting. That night inside the Hartley mansion, Maddie sat quietly as the house stilled. The servants had retreated, the children asleep. Only she and her mother-in-law, Eleanor Hartley, remained in the great living room. The fire burned low shadows stretching across the high ceilings. Eleanor, sharp-eyed, despite her age, studied Maddie for a long while before speaking. "Your husband is playing a dangerous game," she said. Her voice carried the firmness of a woman who had built her life on appearances. And the family name doesn't take kindly to scandal. Maddie pressed her hands together and her lap nails digging into her skin. "He's under pressure. He says it's just rumors. He says no one can touch him without proof." Eleanor leaned closer, her pearl necklace catching the firelight. "Rumors are enough to ruin a man if they grow teeth. Don't be naive, Maddie. You're my daughter-in-law, and I've stood by you. But you need to think about what happens when people stop believing the show." Maddie's eyes filled, though she blinked quickly to hide it. "What would you have me do, stand against my husband? Shame him in front of his children. He is still my family. Eleanor's lips tightened, but her gaze softened. Family is not blind loyalty. I watched my own husband nearly lose everything because he thought power made him untouchable. I won't watch it happen again. Maddie turned her face away, staring into the fire. The flames danced bright and consuming a mirror of the turmoil inside her. For the first time, she couldn't silence the voice in her head that asked whether her father had been right all along. And while Maddie wrestled with her thoughts, I sat in my quiet house across town, staring at the closed box on my table. Ethan's words still rang in my ears. Nobody's got proof. Sleep had never come easy for me, not since the years after my wife passed. The house creaked too much, the nights stretched too long. But that night I wasn't just restless, I was waiting for the storm I knew would break. The box sat on the table across the room, its shadow long and dark, in the glow of the streetlight seeping through the curtains. When the phone rang sharp and sudden, I nearly dropped the book in my lap. The clock on the wall ticked close to midnight. Calls at that hour are never good news. I lifted the receiver, slowly bracing myself. It was Ethan. His voice, once smooth and practiced, cracked like glass. "Leonard, it's happening. IRS is coming for us. They're auditing everything. Somebody betrayed me." I didn't answer right away. I just listened to words pour in through the line like water through a broken dam. "They've got something files numbers I don't know. But they couldn't have pulled it out of thin air. Someone handed them proof." His voice rose desperate, wild. "It had to be an employee. I knew that Snake Simmons would come back to bite me. I should have fired him years ago." I could hear Maddie in the background, her sobs muffled but unmistakable. Then her voice, raw and broken, broke through the line. "Dad, please. We need you. I don't know what to do." I gripped the receiver tighter. For years I had dreamed of hearing her say those words, not with pride or warmth, but at least with need. Yet now they came wrapped in despair, tethered to Ethan's collapse. I closed my eyes. I could see her face as a child, streaked with tears after scraping her knee, looking to me to make it right. But this wasn't a scraped knee. This was the life she had chosen, built on Ethan's lies, now crumbling around her. "Dad," she whispered again, a plea this time. Ethan cut back, in his voice sharp, angry. "Tell me you had nothing to do with this. Tell me you didn't go running your mouth. You're the only one who's ever been too close to the books." I stayed silent. My breath was steady, but inside every word they spilled tightened the knot in my chest. He was half right. Nobody had betrayed him. Nobody but me. The line crackled with Maddie's sobs and Ethan's ragged curses. I let the noise wash over me. My lips pressed tight. I thought of the lighter in the drawer, the papers on the table, the sermon at St. Mark S. "Honor thy father and mother." The irony cut deep. Finally, I said quietly, "You should get some rest. Tomorrow will come fast." Before they could answer, I set the receiver back in its cradle. The click echoed through the house, final and sharp. I sat in the silence that followed, my heart pounding, the sound of Maddie's cry still lingering in my ears. I sat there for a long while after hanging up the silence, pressing heavy against the walls. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the tick of the wall clock, even the faint whistle of wind through the eaves, all of it seemed louder, as though the house itself knew what I had done, or what I hadn't done. I should have felt triumph, but what settled inside me was more complicated. The sound of Maddie's sobs clung to me like smoke. For years she had treated me as though I were a relic, a burden, a shadow she wished she could sweep away. Now her voice had cracked wide open, calling for me, needing me, and I had given her nothing. Only silence. I walked to the table and laid my hand on the box. The wood was cool beneath my palm, steady, unyielding. Inside were the pages Ethan swore could never exist. Proof that could break him. Proof that could save her, depending on how she chose to see it. I whispered to the empty room, "They'll never believe it was me. They'll blame the others first." And that was true. Already Ethan had convinced himself it was Simmons, the old employee he'd once dismissed with a sneer. Red herrings are easy when you've made enemies, and Ethan had made plenty. Let him chase the wrong ghost while the real truth sat here waiting. I paced the length of the living room, each step creaking against the old floorboards. My wife's photograph watched me from the mantel. I lifted it, brushing a finger across the frame. She would not have flinched from the choice. She would have said, "Do what's right, Leonard. Not for revenge, for truth." But revenge and truth often look like brothers, and I wasn't sure which one had driven my hand to keep these papers all these years. The clock chimed once, sharp and hollow. Past midnight now. I poured myself a glass of water, the tap sputtering before it ran smooth. The cool taste steadied me, but it didn't ease the weight in my chest. I thought of Maddie again, her voice breaking through the phone. "Dad, please, we need you." For the first time in years, she had spoken the word "we" as if it included me, and I had turned her plea into an echo. I set the glass down and returned to the chair by the phone. If they called again, I didn't know whether I would answer. But I knew one thing: the cracks in Ethan's empire had spread past repair. And when the walls finally came down, Maddie would have to decide which side of the rubble she stood on. It was strange how something so small could weigh so much. The wood was plain, the folders ordinary, yet together they carried the kind of truth that could topple a man like Ethan. And they had. The cracks in his empire weren't rumors or accidents. They were the consequence of choices I had set in motion. I let out a breath long and slow. I could finally admit it, if only to the empty room I was the one who sent the files. It hadn't been Simmons, or any of the other scapegoats Ethan would line up in his mind. It had been me standing in the post office a few days after the anniversary party, my hands steady as I sealed the envelope. I remember the woman at the counter, her glasses sliding down her nose as she weighed the package. She had smiled politely, asked if I wanted insurance. I shook my head and said no. Some things don't need insurance. Some things are meant to burn if they're lost. I dropped the envelope into the slot, listening for the soft thud as it landed. That sound has followed me ever since. Quieter than thunder, quieter than a slammed door, but more final than both. It was not rage that pushed me then, though rage had lived in me for years. It was not even the sting of Maddie's words at the party, though they had cut deeper than any knife. No, it was something quieter. The knowledge that I had been holding the truth too long, and that silence once meant as love had become complicity. People think revenge roars, but sometimes it whispers. Sometimes silence is the loudest justice. As I sat there in the dim light of my kitchen, I knew there was no turning back. Ethan's empire would continue to crumble, and Maddie's tears would keep me awake at night. But I had chosen. The weight of those papers was no longer mine to carry. I reached for my coffee cup, though it had gone cold. The taste was bitter, but it steadied me. For the first time in years, I felt like a man who had finally told the truth, even if the world didn't know it was me. I sometimes wonder if I looked different that morning when I stood shaving in the mirror. Did my eyes hold the weight of what I had done? Did my face betray the truth I carried? Or did I look like every other old man in town lining up at the post office, nodding to neighbors on the way to church? That's the thing about secrets. They don't announce themselves. They live in silence, coiled like rope, waiting for the right moment to tighten. As the days passed, the news spread faster than wildfire in August. Reports on the radio, whispers in the pews at St. Mark's, even Thomas hinting more than he should over coffee at the diner. They've got him in a vice, Leonard. Whoever sent those files knew exactly where to cut. I only stirred my cup, letting the steam rise between us. I could have told him. I could have leaned in and said, "It was me. I mailed the truth in a plain brown envelope while the world slept." But I didn't. Some truths aren't for sharing. They're for living with. At night, when the house went still, I replayed the moment at the mailbox. The sound of the envelope slipping from my hand. The finality of it. I realized then that my life had been defined by what I kept inside. First, the grief from my wife, then the disappointment with Maddie, and now the knowledge that I had been both her protector and her undoing. Silence had been my prison for years, yet now silence had become my weapon. I had spoken louder by saying nothing than I ever could have with words. I think that's what age teaches you, that justice doesn't always come with a gavel or a crowd. Sometimes it comes with the quiet drop of paper into a slot, the whisper of a secret finally set free. The news broke on a gray morning, the kind that carried the smell of rain even before the clouds opened. I had just finished pouring my first cup of coffee when the radio announcer's voice came through sharp and clipped like a knife cutting bread. Seattle-based Hartley Real Estate has declared bankruptcy amid an ongoing federal investigation. The IRS confirmed early this morning that a full audit is underway. Sources say records of tax fraud and mismanagement have surfaced, stretching back several years. The words filled the kitchen louder than the hum of the refrigerator, louder than the rain tapping against the glass. I set my cup down, watching the coffee ripple inside. I had known this day was coming, but knowing and hearing are two different weights to carry. By noon, it wasn't just the radio. The Seattle Times ran a front-page story, the bold letters screaming from the newsstand at the corner store. At the diner, men in flannel jackets leaned over their eggs and hash browns, whispering about the Hartleys. At St. Mark's, the bulletin board was cluttered with notes about prayer requests and bake sales, but it was the hushed voices in the pews that carried the real news. Such a shame, I heard one woman murmur as I passed. They had everything. Everything, I thought, except honesty. It spread through the community like wildfire, the fall of Ethan Hartley. For years he had carried himself as if untouchable, the golden boy of real estate, the man who could turn dirt into diamonds. Now he was just another headline, another warning whispered over coffee cups and after Sunday service. By the end of the week, word reached me that Ethan had been taken to the hospital. Stress, someone said. Breakdown, another guessed. I didn't doubt it. His whole empire had turned to ash in his hands, and a man who builds his life on paper walls doesn't stand strong when the wind comes. That evening, as I sat on my porch with the air cooling around me, Maddie appeared at the end of the walkway. She wasn't dressed like the polished woman I'd seen at the party, all pearls and perfect smiles. Her hair was pulled back hastily, her coat wrinkled, her eyes red from crying. She climbed the steps slowly, as if each one carried a weight she had never borne before. When she reached me, she didn't stand proud or defensive. She folded knees, buckling, and sank into the chair beside me. Her voice cracked, the words spilling out like water from a cracked jar. I lost everything, Dad. Everything. I only wanted to belong. I didn't speak right away. I let the night carry her words, let the silence remind us both of all the years between then and now. The porch light hummed above us, flickering in the cool night air. Maddie sat hunched forward, her hands gripping one another so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a long moment she didn't look at me. She just stared into the dark yard as though the lawn itself might give her an answer. I thought if I kept everything polished, if I stood beside him smiling, it would all hold together, she whispered. But it was a lie, Dad. Everything I built with him was a lie. Her words carried a kind of honesty I hadn't heard from her in years, not since she was a little girl running home from school, blurting out her fears about a test, or about kids who teased her on the playground. Somewhere along the way, that girl had disappeared into Ethan's world of glass and marble where truth was too messy to fit in. You wanted to belong, I said slowly. To the parties, the handshakes, the circles that look at money before they look at faces. She nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. And now they won't even look at me. They've all turned away. I gave up my father to fit in with people who never cared about me. The words cut deeper than she knew. For a moment, I wanted to remind her of every time she had turned me away, every time she'd chosen Ethan's pride over my presence. But looking at her then, shaken, stripped of her illusions, I saw only my daughter. I reached for her hand. It was cold, trembling, but she didn't pull away. Maddie, I said, my voice low. Things built on lies always fall. Maybe it takes years, maybe decades, but they always fall. What matters is what you do when the dust settles. She wept quietly, her shoulders shaking under the porch light's glow. I let her cry, the night carrying her sobs across the yard. For the first time in a long while, I felt no anger. Only a heavy kind of sorrow for the years lost, for the family fractured, for the truth that had cost so much. Ethan lay in a hospital bed, somewhere across town, undone by the empire he had thought would make him untouchable. Maddie sat beside me, broken, but not beyond saving. And I sat between them, the silent witness, the man then, who had pulled the first thread and watched the whole fabric unravel. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft hiss of machines and the faint beeping that marked Ethan's restless sleep. The blinds were half drawn, letting in slivers of Seattle's gray morning light. I sat in the corner, my hands folded in my lap, watching Maddie. She hadn't left Ethan's side for hours. Her hair hung loose around her face the way it used to when she was younger before the pearls and careful updos. Every now and then she dabbed her eyes with a tissue, then crumpled it and set it aside only to reach for another. For the first time in years, she looked less like a woman trying to prove herself and more like a daughter who had lost her way. When she finally turned toward me, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, her voice trembled. "Dad, I was wrong." The words came out halting as though they weighed more than she could carry. I forgot who stood by me when no one else did. I let myself believe I had to be someone else to belong. And in doing that, I pushed away the one person who never asked me to be anything but myself. Her tears spilled freely now, her shoulders shaking as she gripped my hand. The warmth of her touch after so many years of coldness startled me. I looked at her not with triumph, not even with relief, but with a quiet ache that had lived in me too long. My voice came low, steady, carrying the truth I had kept close to my chest. "People only realize the value of family," I said, "when everything else is gone." The words hung in the air, not sharp, not bitter, but heavy enough to settle over us both. Maddie bowed her head, her sobs breaking the silence that followed. Across the room, Ethan stirred in his sleep, muttering incoherently, still trapped in his own unraveling empire. But between Maddie and me, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. A thread frayed and nearly broken tugged taut again. The machines hummed on the blinds, rattled softly in the breeze, and in that small, sterile room, we sat together, surrounded by what had been lost and what little could still be saved. Morning crept slowly into the hospital room, soft light painting pale lines across the floor. Maddie had dozed off in the chair beside me, her head tilted, one hand still clutching mine as though afraid I might slip away. For years she had clung to Ethan, to his promises and power, but in that moment it was my hand she held. I studied her face softened by exhaustion, and I remembered the little girl who used to fall asleep in the back seat after long drives, her cheek pressed to the window, trusting I would get her home. Somewhere along the road she had forgotten. Somewhere along the road I had let her. Ethan stirred again, muttering from his hospital bed. His empire gone, his voice a whisper of a man who had once shouted too loudly. His fall was complete. The mansion, the parties, the sharp suits, they were all gone now, stripped away until only the man remained. The silence in the room grew thick. A nurse came in, checked the monitors, adjusted the IV, and left without a word. The door closed with a gentle click, and the three of us were left alone once more, father-daughter, and the man who had nearly destroyed us both. Maddie woke with a start, blinking away the haze of sleep. She looked at me, then at Ethan, then back at me again. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to speak, but instead she leaned closer, gripping my hand tighter than before. "Don't let go, Dad," she whispered. "I won't," I said simply. We sat there in that quiet, not needing more words. The machines hummed, the light shifted, and the world outside moved on. But inside that room, time seemed to pause. I knew nothing would ever erase the years of distance, the sharp words, the cold shoulders. But I also knew that forgiveness doesn't arrive in grand gestures. It comes in small moments, in hands that choose not to let go, and eyes that finally look back without shame. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe that something fragile, bruised, imperfect could be built again. Not the past, but what remained. And that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.